Let me tell you about Jack Murphy, a man who never intended to change the galaxy but somehow managed to do it anyway while complaining about the coffee quality on an ice planet. Jack was what you might call a professional grump, the kind of foreman who could find fault with a perfectly good sunrise if it happened 5 minutes too early for his taste. Glacialist 7 wasn't exactly what the tourism brochures would call a tropical paradise. Picture Antarctica, but bigger, colder, and with the added charm of being 300 light-years from the nearest decent pizza. The Galactic Mining Consortium had set up shop there to extract quantum crystals because apparently regular crystals weren't fancy enough for interstellar commerce. Every morning at exactly 6:30, Jack would trudge out to the mining platform and witness what he privately called the daily humiliation parade. The Dragonkin workers, these magnificent 7-foot-tall beings with scales that shimmered like frozen starlight, would line up and kneel before the human supervisors. Not a respectful bow, mind you, but a full knee to the ground, head-down grovel that would make a medieval peasant feel embarrassed. The Dragonkin leader was Frostwing Korvac, and if dignity could be measured in metric tons, this guy would break the scales. Even while kneeling in the snow, he carried himself like royalty attending a really unfortunate tea party. His people followed his lead, maintaining their composure while corporate overlords strutted around like peacocks with management degrees. The real puppet masters weren't even human. The Galactic Mining Consortium was run by a collection of alien species who looked like they'd been designed by a committee of accountants with serious imagination deficits. There was Supervisor Glob, who resembled a filing cabinet that had learned to walk and developed opinions about quarterly profits. His assistant, Regional Manager Squint, looked like someone had tried to draw a businessman from memory while blindfolded. These corporate overlords had turned the art of workplace oppression into an intergalactic science. They'd studied every species in the galaxy and found the most psychologically devastating way to break their spirits. For the proud Dragonkin, it was forcing them to kneel before beings they could literally eat for breakfast if they weren't so fundamentally decent. Jack watched this circus every morning while sipping coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through a gym sock, and each day his internal commentary got a little more colorful. He'd started keeping a mental tally of how many galactic labor laws were being violated before lunch break, but he'd run out of fingers and toes by week 2. The worst part wasn't the kneeling itself. It was watching Korvac's eyes during the ritual, seeing the quiet resignation of someone who'd been beaten down by a system designed to grind dignity into industrial paste. Here was a being whose ancestors had soared between stars when humans were still figuring out fire, but reduced to genuflecting for the amusement of creatures who'd never done an honest day's work in their gelatinous lives. Tuesday started like any other day in paradise, if paradise was a frozen wasteland run by corporate psychopaths with delusions of competence. Jack was nursing his morning coffee substitute and watching the kneeling ritual when Supervisor Glob decided to add some variety to the humiliation. Today we implement new efficiency protocols, Glob announced through his translator box, which somehow made his voice sound even more irritating than usual. All Dragonkin workers will remain kneeling for 15 minutes while we review their performance metrics. 15 minutes doesn't sound like much until you're doing it on frozen ground in sub-zero temperatures. Jack watched Korvac's people endure it with their usual stoic grace, but he could see the tremor in their limbs, the way their breath formed larger clouds as their bodies fought to stay warm. Then Regional Manager Squint decided to get creative. Worker designation Frostwing Korvac, your mining output was 0.3% below target yesterday. Please explain this inefficiency while maintaining proper submission posture. Korvac's response was measured, respectful, and completely reasonable. He explained how an equipment malfunction had delayed operations for 37 minutes and how he'd personally worked overtime to minimize production loss. His voice never wavered, never showed the anger that Jack could see burning behind his golden eyes. Squint wasn't satisfied. Explanations are not acceptable. Productivity shortfalls require corrective action. He produced some kind of energy prod and moved toward Korvac. That's when Jack's internal monologue shifted from sarcastic to something considerably less printable. Here he was, a guy who'd taken this job because it paid well, and he liked working with minimal supervision, watching an advanced civilization engage in what basically amounted to high-tech slavery. The cosmic irony wasn't lost on him. Humans had spent most of their history getting stepped on by bigger, stronger, or more numerous groups. They'd been conquered, colonized, and generally treated like the galaxy's comic relief. Then they'd finally made it to the stars, joined the big leagues, and what did they do? They immediately started helping other species do the stepping. Jack had always prided himself on being a practical man. He fixed things that were broken, organized things that were chaotic, and generally tried to keep the universe running smoothly in his small corner of it. But watching that energy prod move toward Korvac, he realized that some things were broken in ways that required more than routine maintenance. The Dragonkin could have ended this humiliation any time they wanted. Jack had seen them work, had watched them lift equipment that should have required 3 humans and a forklift. Their natural ice manipulation abilities made them perfect for this environment, but they could just as easily turn those abilities toward creating a corporate popsicle collection. But they didn't. They followed their leader's example of quiet dignity, believing that somehow, somewhere, justice would eventually notice their situation and fix it. Jack had to admire their faith in the system, even while thinking it was completely misplaced. The moment Squint's prod touched Korvac's shoulder, Jack made a decision that would echo across the galaxy. He didn't make it because he was brave or noble or particularly heroic. He made it because he was tired, annoyed, and completely fed up with watching good people get treated badly by idiots with clipboards. "Hey, Squint." "Say." Jack called out, his voice carrying across the mining platform with the authority of a man who'd spent 20 years telling people exactly what he thought of their bright ideas. "Why don't you pick on someone your own size? Or better yet, someone who actually cares what you think?" What happened next was not what anyone would call a carefully planned military operation. Jack Murphy was a foreman, not a general, and his idea of strategic thinking usually involved figuring out which end of a tool to hold. But sometimes the universe rewards good intentions and pure stubbornness more than proper planning. Squint turned his energy prod toward Jack, apparently deciding that insubordination from humans was even worse than inefficiency from Dragon. "Foreman Murphy, you will return to your duties immediately or face disciplinary action." Jack looked around the mining platform, taking inventory of available resources with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades making broken things work with whatever materials happened to be lying around. He had a Class 7 industrial excavator, several tons of mining equipment, and a workforce of beings who could freeze water with their breath, and had excellent reason to be upset with management. "You know what, Squint? I think it's time for some disciplinary action of my own." Jack fired up the excavator and aimed it directly at the communication array that connected the mining platform to corporate headquarters. The massive drill bit, designed to punch through solid ice, made remarkably short work of supposedly military-grade electronics. Korvac's head snapped up, his golden eyes meeting Jack's with an expression that might have been surprise if Dragonkin faces were easier to read. The other workers remained kneeling, but Jack could see the subtle shift in their posture, the way they were suddenly paying very close attention to developments. "What are you doing?" Supervisor Glob demanded, his gelatinous form quivering with indignation. "Equipment maintenance," Jack replied cheerfully, swinging the excavator toward the security station. "Amazing how these things break down when you don't treat them properly." The corporate security team consisted of 6 hired enforcers from various species, all of whom looked very impressive in their matching uniforms and completely lost when faced with a man operating heavy machinery with malicious intent. They were trained to handle worker unrest, not industrial sabotage performed with cheerful competence. Korvac slowly rose to his feet, ice crystals forming around his claws. "Foreman Murphy," he said carefully, "are you attempting what I believe you are attempting?" "Depends," Jack replied, using the excavator to demolish the administrative building's east wall. "If you think I'm attempting to give these corporate parasites the worst day of their careers, then yes, that's exactly what I'm attempting." The other Dragonkin began standing up, and suddenly the temperature on the platform dropped 15 degrees. It turns out that when you have a group of naturally gifted ice manipulators who've been storing up resentment for months, things get very cold very quickly. Security Enforcer Prime, a hulking creature that looked like a rhinoceros, had been crossbred with a parking meter, charged at Jack with what might have been tactical competence if Jack hadn't simply driven the excavator sideways and knocked him into a conveniently placed snowdrift. "This is highly irregular," Supervisor Glob protested, apparently still under the impression that proper procedures mattered in the middle of a worker uprising. "You want to see irregular?" Korvac asked, and demonstrated the Dragonkin ability to create instant ice sculptures by flash-freezing 3 security enforcers in mid-stride. They weren't hurt, just temporarily converted into very confused popsicles. Jack had to admit, watching the Dragonkin work was genuinely impressive. They moved with coordinated precision, using their natural abilities to systematically disable every piece of corporate infrastructure on the platform. It was like watching a choreographed dance performed by beings who really wanted to redecorate the workplace. Within 30 minutes, the Galactic Mining Consortium's most profitable extraction site had been converted into what could generously be called an abstract art installation. The communication arrays were scrap metal, the security systems were frozen solid, and the administrative staff were huddled in the one remaining building, frantically calling for reinforcements on personal communicators. "Well," Jack said, surveying their handiwork with the satisfaction of a job properly done, "I guess we're unemployed now." Korvac's laugh sounded like wind chimes made of icicles. "Foreman Murphy, I believe we may have just started something considerably larger than a workplace dispute." Jack Murphy had always believed that if you were going to get fired, you might as well make it memorable. He just hadn't expected his pink slip to become intergalactic news within 6 hours. The first sign that their little workplace disagreement had attracted attention was the arrival of Galactic News Network reporter Zara Brightscale, a serpentine journalist who specialized in labor disputes and apparently had a faster-than-light travel budget that most corporations would envy. This is Zara Brightscale reporting live from Glacial 7, where a human foreman and a group of Dragoncornkers have just shut down one of the galaxy's most profitable mining operations in what experts are calling either a labor uprising or a very expensive temper tantrum. Jack watched the news broadcast from the abandoned cafeteria, sharing freeze-dried rations with Korvac while corporate reinforcements presumably headed their way at maximum warp. Did she just call this a temper tantrum? Human news media has always struggled with nuance. Korvac replied diplomatically. The story spread across the galactic information networks faster than corporate damage control could contain it. Apparently, the image of proud Dragonkin kneeling before human supervisors while alien executives counted profits had struck a nerve with working beings across multiple star systems. On Crystalline Homeworld, the silicon-based miners were asking uncomfortable questions about their own working conditions. The tentacled collective had called an emergency assembly to discuss workplace dignity. Even the usually compliant Mushroom Federation was making disapproving spores about labor practices. Jack's personal communicator, which he'd honestly forgotten he owned, started receiving calls from reporters, labor organizers, and what sounded like several different galactic rights organizations. He answered one call by accident and found himself talking to Supreme Labor Advocate Nexus Fairwing, an avian legal expert who spoke very fast and used a lot of words Jack didn't recognize. "Foreman Murphy, you've created a legal precedent that could reshape interstellar labor law. Are you prepared to testify before the Galactic Council?" "Lady, I'm prepared to eat lunch and maybe take a nap. I wasn't trying to reshape anything except that squint guy's attitude problem." Meanwhile, the Galactic Mining Consortium stock price was performing what financial experts technically called a spectacular nosedive. Chief Executive Blorg held an emergency press conference that managed to make the situation significantly worse. "The actions on Glacial 7 represent a clear violation of established corporate policy," Blorg announced to a room full of increasingly skeptical reporters. "We maintain that all workers, regardless of species, are treated with appropriate levels of management oversight. By appropriate levels, do you mean forcing them to kneel in freezing temperatures? Asked a reporter from the Financial Times of Andromeda. Kneeling is a sign of respect in many cultures, Blorg replied, apparently unaware that he was being broadcast to those exact cultures, most of whom were now explaining very loudly that no, it really wasn't. The Galactic Council called an emergency session, something that hadn't happened since the Great Trade War of 2387. Council President Harmony Goldfeather, an elderly avian who'd been mediating interspecies disputes since before Jack was born, issued a statement that managed to be both diplomatic and pointed. Recent events have highlighted the need for comprehensive review of current labor practices across all member worlds. The Council will be conducting hearings to address these concerns. Jack read the statement while sitting in what used to be Supervisor Glob's office, his feet up on a desk covered in frozen corporate paperwork. Korvac, I think we might have accidentally started something important. Yes, Korvac agreed, ice crystals forming in patterns of what looked like satisfaction around his claws. Accidentally. The irony wasn't lost on Jack. Humans had spent centuries fighting for their own rights, from basic working conditions to representation in interstellar government. Now they'd somehow ended up in a position where their cooperation was essential to keeping other species oppressed. It was like being promoted from victim to accomplice without anybody asking if that was really what you wanted on your resume. Corporate lawyers were already preparing their defense, undoubtedly planning to argue that the whole thing was just a misunderstanding between different cultural approaches to workplace management. They were probably very confident in their legal position right up until the moment they realized they'd have to make that argument in front of representatives from every species they'd been systematically mistreating. The Galactic Council chambers on Central Station made an impressive backdrop for what was essentially a very expensive argument about workplace etiquette. Jack had never been in a building that could hold 50,000 beings from 200 different species, and he had to admit the architecture was genuinely impressive, even if the politics were generally ridiculous. Council President Harmony Goldfeather called the session to order with the kind of authority that comes from spending decades dealing with interstellar bureaucracy. We are here to address the recent events on Glacialus 7 and their implications for labor practices throughout the galaxy. Jack found himself at the witness table, uncomfortably aware that his testimony was being broadcast to approximately 40 billion beings across known space. He'd prepared remarks, but they mostly consisted of variations on "I just wanted people to stop being jerks to each other." The prosecution was led by Corporate Legal Director Smugworth, a being that looked like a briefcase had achieved sentience and developed strong opinions about quarterly earnings. Your Honor, the actions of Foreman Murphy represent a clear violation of established corporate hierarchy and threaten the foundation of interstellar commerce. Jack leaned toward his microphone. Your Honor, I'd like to point out that their foundation apparently involves making people kneel in the snow while jerks with energy prods lecture them about productivity. If that's the foundation of interstellar commerce, maybe we need a different foundation. Smugworth's response involved a lot of legal terminology that basically boiled down to "but we've always done it this way," which Jack thought was probably the weakest argument he'd ever heard for continuing to do anything. Korvac took the stand next, and his testimony was everything Jack's wasn't: eloquent, measured, and devastating. He spoke about dragon history, about a species that had achieved interstellar flight when most of the galaxy was still figuring out agriculture, now reduced to kneeling before beings whose greatest achievement was optimizing profit margins. "We accepted these conditions," Korvac said, his voice carrying across the chamber with the kind of dignity that made everyone sit up straighter, "because we believed in the promise of galactic civilization. We believed that cooperation would lead to mutual respect. We were mistaken." The corporate defense team tried to argue that the kneeling was simply a cultural misunderstanding, that different species had different ways of showing workplace respect. This argument lasted approximately 30 seconds before representatives from 17 different species stood up to explain exactly what they thought of that particular interpretation. The crystalline delegate's testimony was especially effective since silicon-based beings apparently express indignation by literally glowing with righteous fury. The defendant corporations have systematically exploited cultural differences to maximize worker compliance while minimizing compensation. But this is not cultural exchange, it is cultural weaponization. Jack's favorite moment came when Smugworth tried to argue that human supervisors were simply following corporate policy and couldn't be held responsible for the conditions they enforced. Your Honor, my client was merely following established protocols. Let me get this straight, Jack interrupted, ignoring his lawyer's frantic gestures. Your defense is that humans are too stupid to know right from wrong unless someone writes it down in a manual? Because I've got to tell you, that's not exactly the image of my species I want broadcast to 40 billion beings. The tide really turned when other species began testifying about their own working conditions. It turned out that the Galactic Mining Consortium had been very creative in finding psychologically devastating ways to break the spirit of each species they employed. The aquatic builders were forced to work in artificially heated environments. The photosynthetic engineers were kept in dimly lit facilities. The musical healers were required to work in complete silence. Judge Harmony Goldfeather's final statement was delivered with the kind of controlled fury that comes from realizing you've been presiding over a legal system that had somehow legitimized systematic oppression while everyone was too busy following procedures to notice. This court finds that current labor practices constitute a violation of fundamental principles of dignity and respect that should apply to all sentient beings, regardless of species or corporate affiliation. The defendant's arguments regarding cultural differences are not only legally insufficient but morally reprehensible. The ruling established what became known as the Universal Dignity Doctrine. No being could be required to perform acts of submission or degradation as a condition of employment, regardless of local custom, corporate policy, or species-specific characteristics. Jack watched Smugworth's briefcase-like form deflate as the implications sank in. Every major corporation in the galaxy was about to face lawsuits from approximately 300 different species, and the legal bills alone would probably crash several interstellar economies. Foreman Murphy, Judge Goldfeather said, "Do you have any final comments for this court?" Jack thought about it for a moment. Your Honor, I just want to say that I never intended to change galactic law. I just wanted to get through my workday without watching good people get treated badly by idiots. If that accidentally fixed something important, then I guess that's what happens when you finally get tired of minding your own business. 6 months later, Jack Murphy was still getting used to being accidentally famous. The Universal Dignity Doctrine had reshaped labor law across the galaxy, and somehow he'd become the poster child for workers' rights, which was absolutely not what he'd had in mind when he'd started his day by demolishing corporate infrastructure with a mining excavator. Glacialus 7 had been transformed from a corporate extraction site into what the news media were calling a model of interspecies cooperation. The Dragonkin had formed a workers' cooperative that contracted with ethical mining companies. Korvac had been elected as their representative to the Galactic Labor Council, and the quantum crystal production was actually higher than it had been under corporate management. It turns out, Korvac explained during one of their regular lunch meetings, that workers are considerably more productive when they're not spending half their energy dealing with systematic humiliation. Jack nodded while working on what had become his favorite hobby, reading reports about corporate executives trying to explain to their shareholders why respecting worker dignity was somehow going to bankrupt interstellar commerce. Who could have predicted that treating people decently would improve performance? It's almost like basic psychology applies across species lines. The Galactic Mining Consortium had restructured 3 times, fired its entire executive board, and was currently operating under court supervision while implementing what their lawyers called dignity-compliant workplace protocols. Their stock price had recovered somewhat after they'd discovered that having a workforce that didn't hate them actually improved both productivity and safety ratings. Other corporations had adapted with varying degrees of grace. Some had embraced the new standards and found that ethical labor practices were surprisingly good for business. Others had spent fortunes on legal challenges, lobbying efforts, and creative interpretations of what constituted dignity, most of which had been struck down by courts that were apparently tired of dealing with corporate creativity. Jack's personal favorite was the case of Tentacle Industries versus the Crystalline Miners Union, where corporate lawyers had argued that silicon-based beings didn't technically qualify as workers under traditional definitions. The judge's response had become required reading in law schools across 17 star systems. The ripple effects had spread far beyond labor law. The universal dignity doctrine had been cited in civil rights cases, diplomatic disputes, and at least one interstellar war crimes tribunal. Apparently, once you established that all sentient beings deserved basic respect regardless of species, it became much harder to justify a lot of behaviors that various governments and corporations had considered perfectly acceptable. Jack had been offered book deals, movie rights, speaking engagements, and what one enterprising aquatic entrepreneur had called educational experience packages where tourists could visit historically significant workplace uprising sites. But he'd turned down all of them, partly because he valued his privacy and partly because he suspected that most people wanted to hear a more heroic version of events than "I got annoyed and broke things until the problem went away." The one offer he'd accepted was a consulting position with the Galactic Labor Council, mostly because it let him travel around the galaxy fixing workplace problems before they required heavy machinery to resolve. It was essentially the same job he'd always done, just with a bigger office and considerably more paperwork. The ironic thing, Jack told Korvac during their latest conversation, is that I spent most of my career trying to avoid getting involved in other people's problems. Turns out that when you finally decide to get involved, the problems get solved a lot faster than when you spend years complaining about them. Korvac's laugh still sounded like wind chimes, but warmer now, less brittle around the edges. Perhaps that is the real lesson, Foreman Murphy. Sometimes the solution to systematic oppression is simply one individual who decides they have had enough. Yeah, well, next time someone wants to change galactic law, they can do it themselves. I'm retired from accidental revolution. From now on, I'm sticking to intentional equipment maintenance and deliberately eating lunch on schedule. But even as he said it, Jack knew it wasn't entirely true. The galaxy was full of problems that needed solving, and most of them were caused by the same basic issue: people in power who'd forgotten that everyone else was people too. Sometimes it took someone with a mining excavator and a complete lack of respect for corporate hierarchy to remind them. The universe, it turned out, had a sense of humor after all. It had taken a career foreman who just wanted to do his job in peace and turned him into a symbol of interspecies solidarity. And somehow, despite all his complaints about the inconvenience of accidentally changing galactic law, Jack had to admit that the new universe was a considerably better place to work. Even if the coffee still tasted terrible,